Hey everybody, I'm Diana Marquis, and you're listening to About Fundraising, the podcast, where we talk about all things related to nonprofits. For new listeners, here's a little about me. I spent 20 years as a fundraiser for different nonprofits before moving to the consulting side, where I work with charities on their fundraising and board training. My podcast is my way of sharing my resources with you, the listener. I'd love to speak with you directly about your fundraising needs. Schedule your free half-hour consultation at my website, dmgroupconsulting.com. We've got a good episode today. We'll be talking with Danica Mendragle. Danica is an attorney in Dallas who specializes in nonprofits and tax laws. Thanks for listening, and enjoy my conversation with Danica Mendragle. I'd like to start with talking about nonprofits, whether they're big or small, whether they serve thousands of people or a neighborhood. And that's about the laws and regulations that govern all of them. What are some of the most common legal mistakes that nonprofits make in relation to state and federal laws? That's a big one.
One of the things that we do quite a lot of is coming into organizations that have been up and running for maybe 2 or 3 years, maybe 5, maybe 50, and doing kind of a health check, right? And over the course of 20 years of doing that sort of work, we have kind of pulled together like a checklist, right, of the things that we see, the things that are the common misunderstandings or lack of awareness or, just areas, opportunities for education. It's a long list. We'll see how many we want to talk about today. But I think maybe the biggest one that I would share is, really not related to the actual governance rules or the actual tax compliance side of things, but rather broader. It's really understanding the organization that you work within from a corporate and tax perspective. So, for example, when we start working with an organization, we say, okay, give us all your things, give us all your documents, let us see where you're at. And oftentimes they don't know what they are. They think they're a nonprofit. They don't know if they're a 50C what or a 503C. We hear that a lot. They don't know what they are. And if you don't know what you are in this space, you can't possibly know what rules apply to you, right? And that runs the gamut, whether it is, are you a nonprofit? Are you tax exempt under the federal tax rules, which means, of course, you don't pay tax? Are you charitable? Are you some other kind of tax exempt? It kind of runs through all of that, and then it digs down a little deeper into, okay, well, maybe you're a 501c3, maybe you're charitable, but, what are you? What are you within that? Are you a public charity? Are you a private foundation? Are you something else? And then if you shift over and look at kind of the state side of things, there's a question of, well, what's your entity? Are you a trust? Are you a nonprofit corporation? Are you something else? Are you an association or one of the more, newfangled entities, an LLC or a mutual benefit association or what have you? So there's a whole litany of kind of classifications. And what we find probably more than anything as clients who don't, or just organizations out in the sector that don't really understand, and staff that don't really understand where they slot in a way that doesn't enable them to even know what subjective rules to ask about or to comply with. That was a long answer.
That's really scary. That is really scary. I can understand maybe if you're a membership organization, that's a different 50C number.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're, maybe a private foundation, except even then, it seems like you would know that you're a private foundation.
One would think, yes.
But anyway, so that's really
scary. I think it just gets confusing. But I think the what I have noticed since I started talking about this particular topic and presenting on it, is I'll sit here and I'll go on and say, well, these clients or these organizations that don't even know what they are. And then I hear myself say throughout the same presentation, using the phrases nonprofit, charity, interchangeably. And they're not. But, I think, no, they're not. So, okay, so there we go. But this is common. And again, we all use the phrase interchangeably. So one would think it would be. So nonprofit, although used pervasively, is a state status, and it doesn't mean a whole lot. It really refers to predominantly like a nonprofit corporation, which is just an entity status, like a C corporation or a LLC or what have you. It's a entity type. It has very few restrictions on it, a couple. One big one is that nonprofits are, kind of treated as owned by the public, if you will. They don't have ownership in the traditional sense. But the rules that apply to the broader tax-exempt sector, most of them are based in federal law or other state law, not in the, and I'm air quoting here, nonprofit status of the entity. Charity is 501c3. And that is charitable, tax exempt, and eligible for a deduction. So yeah, they're used interchangeably, but in my world, quite different.
I wonder. I mean, this is like more of a kind of a historical question. I don't really know if you would have an answer for this. I would think at some point, somewhere along the way, it was some sort of like PR or marketing decision to get away from the word charity and say nonprofit. I don't know. That's just me totally speculating. I don't know.
No, I wonder. I mean, I think if I look at it from the technical side and look at the things that we end up looking at within C3, so even though I'm already contradicting myself, right? Within 501c3, if you look at like the definition in the Internal Revenue Code, it lists other stuff, right? There's charity in there, but there's education, there's religion. Within that, an educational organization is not necessarily a charitable organization. So I think that's why is nonprofit sort of blankets it all in a way that's perfectly fine and acceptable if we're just conversing. But it does confuse, the ED or executive director or CEO wearing 85 different hats. It can be a little confusing as to what that means. So,
oh, heck yes.
Yeah.
It is. And then even more confusing are, like you said, the staff that are not that close to having to deal with those kind of definitions, and then with board members. So I want a war story.
Oh gosh,
how
many would you like?
Well, you can just give me one or two, but a situation, an organization, or person, or whatever that you really had to straighten out, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, there's so many. Okay. I think one of the things, and I think I used this phrase when we were kind of catching up before the podcast started, we affectionately call it very well-intentioned non-compliance. And that is what we see, predominant. I mean, so predominant throughout the sector. So there's a lot of that. And it comes in so many different ways. One of the things we see, I mentioned when we come in and do this health check, right? We say, okay, give us all your documents. And they're like, okay, here's my articles of incorporation. Our bylaws, we're not really sure. I mean, I think we had them, but we don't really follow them. Or, and then just kind of a blank stare. Or maybe we get the email back with the documents and it's just missing from the list of documents, like just not there. We see a lot of disconnect between what I think should be, says the lawyer, esoterically speaking here, but what I think should be the backbone of an organization. The core documents that set forth what it's supposed to do, what it's told the public and the IRS it should do, and how it has told itself and the external, constituents it would run itself. So articles or certificate now, and bylaws. Some of the biggest, and these are not juicy, but some of the biggest things that we have seen are related to those disconnects. So I think that a lot of organizations, staff, folks out in the sector that haven't dealt with someone like us dealing with some of these problems, look at those documents and just kind of roll their eyes and think, well, gosh, these are just, legal housekeeping issues. Like, I'm sure it's all very, it's fine if we don't worry about it. But the interesting thing that we see, and we see it time and time again, is if, say, your bylaws say that you have to elect your board in a certain way, and your board has to be composed of one person from this organization, or two people elected this way, or certain people meeting certain qualifications, and you've neglected to do that. Okay, well, do you have a board? Do you have anyone who's authorized to act? What if you figure this out, 20 years after you've been doing it, and you've bought property and you've hired people and you've done all sorts of things? And you look back and think, well, gosh, who was actually authorized to do that all that time? Because we had a board acting and claiming authority, but they weren't even ever properly elected under the rules we set for ourselves. And it sounds esoteric, but then you kind of fast forward out and say, okay, well, what if there's a lawsuit? What do you think that attorney, that plaintiff's attorney, not someone like me, I'm very warm and fuzzy, transactional, but what if what if there's a plaintiff's attorney and she comes in? The first thing they're going to do is say, oh no, none of you have any of the protections of a nonprofit corporation because you weren't even properly elected. The whole thing is a sham. We're going to poke right through it and sue everybody and hold everyone to the fire. And yet it all kind of goes back to that silly little legal document that no one ever paid a whole lot of attention to and maybe can't even find. So I don't know how juicy that is. Sounds a little scary, but that's the kind of thing that we see over and over again.
Well, not just attorneys see that.
Yes.
Others of us, that work with nonprofits see that as well. And it is really scary. And the I don't know, scarier or whatever part of it is, like you're saying, the well-intentioned noncompliance, they don't get that there's an issue here and don't seem just, really concerned about fixing it.
Yeah.
So that's really hard. So I have a question kind of on the other side of that.
Yeah.
And this is something, honestly, that, I'm asking for some free advice here.
That's okay. It happens. It's an industry hazard.
How do you deal with an experienced, well-intentioned board member or members who believe that they know all about board governance and how to run and know how to run a nonprofit, but are not necessarily up to date on current laws and regulations?
Yeah. No, we never see that. Not at all. Not ever. Not with every single client we deal with. No, it is, to your point, and again, that phrase of noncompliance, right? I think that there is this just completely pervasive perception within the sector, more so with your sort of mid-sized to smaller organizations, but you see it with the big ones as well, that, we're just doing good. I saw this, we were reviewing documents 7 or 8 years ago, one of our early firm clients, and it was a very large school-related kind of booster club PTA type organization, and we were reading an email exchange, and one of the parents, verbatim typed, well, no one's ever going to look at us. We're just a little fill in the blank. We're just trying to do good for our kids. No one's ever going to care. The IRS wouldn't come and get us. And that person might be right, but that's the perception. And that's not, it doesn't coincide with reality. And it makes it really difficult when you run into that board member who's been on 5 boards, maybe is extraordinarily sophisticated and experienced in the for-profit realm or the entrepreneurial realm, right? You're nodding your head because we recognize the dynamic there, right? And between that combination of kind of the do-good halo and the expectation of, well, I've been doing this for so long and nothing's ever gone wrong, it's really hard, especially when, you look at things and say, okay, well, the odds of, the state enforcing something, the odds of the IRS enforcing something, it's not super high right now, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing the right things. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be compliant. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be complying with the rules just because we think we might escape getting our hands slapped. And obviously that's not the way we advise our clients. So it creates a really difficult situation. In all honesty, we usually go the route of, gee whiz, don't you want to be compliant, and kind of have that discussion. If that doesn't work, then we usually jump pretty quickly to fiduciary duties and talk about just how scary it really could be if you're acting outside the bounds of your organization's purposes, not complying with your organizational documents, just how, imposing it can be from a personal perspective if you're not fulfilling those fiduciary duties, or goodness forbid if you're, like a responsible party from the IRS perspective, what that could look like. So, we will go to the place of, fear if the carrot doesn't work. And sometimes a combination of those two works quite effectively.
How often should bylaws be reviewed and or revised? And who does that?
Yeah. So this is going to sound self-serving because we're lawyers. We do that. We do a lot of that. Not my favorite work, if I'm being honest, because we do much more exciting, interesting tax work that I really enjoy. But on the bylaws front, while it sounds self-serving, I think my view is if they are not kept up properly, or if they are set aside and not maintained in an organization's awareness, that it will result in bigger problems. And those bigger problems will probably still land you on my desk, and it will almost certainly require much more work and much more in way of fees. So to answer your actual question, I don't think there is a clear guiding principle. I think in my perfect ideal view, bylaws should be pretty regularly consulted, right? They talk about what the board can do, what the powers of the board are, how meetings work, how boards make decisions, when they come together, what quorum is, what the votes are. They talk about officers in the same way, not just election, but powers and authorities and limitations. All of that should be part of an organization's regular operation. And, maybe that's not pulling the full document every time. Maybe it's with a cheat sheet. We do those for clients. We do governance cheat sheets quite often so that the admin can help facilitate the meetings in a way that's efficient. And if you're doing that, and if you recognize that that document is quite important, then you will inherently know, oh, okay, this thing doesn't work for us anymore. We can't ever meet quorum. We need to change it, or can we change it? We can't ever find, board members that meet the requisite composition. Okay, let's change it. So I think if it's just built in to the organization, then there shouldn't need to be like a sit-down annual periodic sort of review process. I'm fine with that too, but I would much rather it just be innately part of the backbone of an organization's administration. I think it's a little different for the articles or their certificate because they don't have as much that is operational in them. There's more to it from a legal perspective, but from a day-to-day perspective, the most important part is the purposes. For us, with our clients, we always make sure those are in the bylaws so that they just have one document they can just refer to always. But if it's not there, that's really the one thing to pay attention to in the certificate or the articles as well is, what did you tell the public you would do? What is your, what this kind of public trust that you are endowed with by virtue of being a nonprofit and a tax-exempt or charitable organization? What is that based on? And is it still, say, what you're doing today?
That speaks to two different things that come to mind. One is mission creep, which, is or chasing the money. And the other is, I guess, in more recent experience with COVID, where maybe an organization was an after-school program and they became a food distribution center.
Right, out of necessity or maybe just a desire to help.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that is, assuming that was temporary and they go back to being an after-school program, or maybe they add a more robust program to their after-school. I mean, does that get into any kind of legal issues?
Yeah, there's a few. So I would add to your list of, mission creep, yes, staying within the bounds of purposes or shifting purposes over time or evolving purposes over time. That's a second issue. The third one I'd add, which is like the elephant in the room right now, is donor intent. That's the one that we see organizations unexpectedly struggle with. And I don't mean, the Harvard endowment gift that went upside down. I mean, yes, there's plenty of those. We've all seen them in the news. I mean, the after-school organization, for example, in your hypothetical, that has raised a bunch of money, is going along doing their after-school activities and all the things that come with that, and then decides that that's not the best use of their time, endeavor, money, what have you, and wants to, say, shift and do exclusively food distribution. Well, that may not be allowed under state law. The IRS doesn't necessarily care deeply about that so long as the funds are being used charitably, but state regulators sure do, and very possibly some of those donors might. So I think the issues that we see related to that are all tied up and intermingled between those three kind of buckets. By the same token, organizations absolutely can evolve. So when we work with like startups and we're talking about how to draft their purposes, we always encourage them to look out, okay, let's, talk about what you're doing today or tomorrow. Let's look, 5, 10, 15 years at all the what ifs, and let's make sure we include all of them. And let's frame it as broadly as is appropriate. Not because we want to enable them to run off the rails, but because, if we limit to something regionally and say, okay, well, you're going to do X, Y, Z in Texas. Okay, well, it wouldn't be shocking if you all of a sudden want to expand to Oklahoma. Or if you're providing after school care, it wouldn't be shocking if you wanted to provide ancillary services, mentoring for single parents in your program, or tutoring that goes beyond your original. It happens. So the evolution of activities and purposes is normal and fine. I think the bugaboo that we see organizations struggle with or maybe be unaware of is, one, making sure that they are aware of what they said they do and how they're changing, and then jumping through the compliance hoops, whether it be notifying the IRS, changing documents that are necessary to make those changes, and then all the while watching out for how they're using donor funds and whether or not they're doing what they said they would do with those funds. That was a wordy answer. I'm good at those, apparently.
Oh, that is good. And as you were talking, what I was thinking is, well, just thinking, COVID is hopefully a unique experience that we're not going to have to deal with anything similar for a long, long time. That I'm thinking of this, again, it's a hypothetical situation, but I think it's happened in different situations where this after-school program was to serve a particular community, a particular neighborhood, let's say. And that's fine up until that point COVID hit. And then after-school care was not serving the community. They needed food.
Right.
So they intentionally made that shift, assuming the board is along with it, assuming donors are along with it, to serve the community.
Right.
With what they need, not with what the organization thinks they need or donor thinks they need, but like really, what does this community need, and making that shift. And then maybe after the pandemic had, receded, that they go back to more after school program. Nonprofits provide a lot to their communities, and certainly there needs to be some sort of flexibility. But back to your point, the bylaws need to be followed. They need to be the document that preserves the organization and keeps it on track. One of the things you just mentioned about, not that it becomes something that, we need to review our bylaws every year, but it's a living document, using it as a living document.
Exactly.
And I don't see that.
No. I see it with some of our clients, but only some, and only certain ones that are sort of situated in certain ways. A lot of them tend to be more publicly in the public eye. They tend to have broader boards, and sort of, those are the ones that tend to be most focused on it. Although I will say that there's, a nice big chunk, I don't know how I would quantify that, at least 50%. Maybe 50%, even of our client base that, maybe they're not pulling their bylaws every second to look at this, that, or the other, but they do have a general sense, and they will ask us at least. And so, and allow us to navigate for them and say, okay, well, no, this is actually an issue. Have you thought about, is this working? So on and so forth. But no, I wish more organizations would use it as a living document, because I think even in the realm of what we were just talking about, expanding and evolving purposes and activities, the struggles where we end up working with clients who cannot, nonprofits who cannot do what they want to do, it's not the organization that comes to us right away and says, oh my goodness, we want to add this thing, but we said we were going to do this other thing. What's our option? That's not the client that's a problem. We're going to be able to figure out a path forward for them in almost any instance. The ones where it's a problem are when they check in 20 years later and they've already expanded 10 times, and they don't look anything like where they started, and they don't know what's happened along the way as it relates to money coming in and activities evolving. Those are the ones that are a challenge. And maybe that's an extreme example, but maybe even 5 years. It's the issue of going too long without making sure that you are in compliance. And I think that relates to most every governance-related issue that a nonprofit can have, whether it's document-driven like we're talking about, or failures in, the governance processes, how they deal with things at meetings, how they adopt things, how they document things. All of those, most of them can be resolved and fixed, or at least mitigated. The issue comes in where you've never done anything or haven't done anything for so many years, and the issues compound upon themselves. That's where it becomes really challenging to detangle and figure out a path forward.
Sticking with the bylaws question, just another question or two. What are the pros and cons of term limits?
I always think that people expect me to have a stronger opinion on this point than I do. And I don't. I think it varies. I think it depends on the organization. There are organizations that come in and it is clearly where they need to end up because their board has become so entrenched and it has become a problem. There's other organizations, particularly startups, where maybe it's a non-issue, or organizations where maybe they do a great job of rolling over and turning over some portion of their board, but they really feel the need to have that institutional knowledge and institutional memory present on the board. There's an organization I work with right now that, quite honestly, their board's getting a bit bigger than I would prefer, but they're doing it intentionally, and they're doing it because they're in a building phase, and there is a desire to maintain the same group of individuals right up until they get to a certain place. And then they will, I think, make a shift and move more towards an operating board rather than the board that is most focused on connections and making things happen. So I think it really, really depends on the circumstances, what an organization is trying to accomplish, who the individuals are that are involved, and who the constituents are that are being served. Is this a family grant-making foundation? That's a little less of a priority. Is it a public-serving, public-facing organization that needs to bring on a variety of constituents? Okay, that's a different scenario. So I am at times in support of them, but I do think the concept of term limits can be overblown because I don't think it's always required in every circumstance.
I can see and agree with what you're saying. What I was thinking of, or what I think of, and who I deal with, are small to mid-sized nonprofits that are service providers, social service agencies or arts organizations. And to me, if the board doesn't have something in place, the organization doesn't have something in place to bring new people in, to let people leave,
and to prompt that process, right?
Yeah. I think that's where I am with the term limits.
And I don't disagree with that. I think there's quite a few scenarios where exactly that is in play. I will say, the way that we tend to draft documents, our standard, starting place documents don't have term limits in them. If we're asked to put them in, I will usually recommend that we include, I call it an opt-out, where it basically says, okay, well, our term limits are X, however the organization wants them to look. And then we give the board, subject to whatever parameters the organization feels are appropriate, we give the board the power to opt out and say, if certain circumstances justify, we can, either ignore these limits, or we can skip one and do one extra, or, what have you. So that, again, you're prompting that discussion and process, and the board has to take an affirmative, definitive action to accept itself from those. But in that instance, you aren't running to the lawyer and saying, oh my goodness, we have to have this person still, because if we lose them right now, our organization will fail and die. You've got that provision in place, but you're still having the conversation, which I think sometimes, to your point, is sometimes almost more important than anything, having that conversation around evolution.
Or this person has to leave or we're all going to kill them.
Yes.
There could be that.
Yes, that could happen too.
Yeah.
Or her.
Yeah, or her. Well, anyway, there is one organization that I used to be involved with, and I share as an example with some of my clients as far as board, development and so forth. And it's a local arts organization. And this, the founder and the artistic director and executive director did not let anybody go.
Ever.
But they had term limits.
Mm-hmm.
So people would serve their 2-3 year terms or whatever, roll off a year and come back on the board.
Yes.
Or they would go to an advisory board, or they would go to an emeritus board, or the gala committee, and just keep rotating them around and grow, because they always, brought on new people too. But I love that example because they kept the institutional knowledge, they kept the donor dollars, they were able to, grow their area of exposure, if you will, to a broader community. But it took so much work.
Yeah.
So much work. But it paid off for them.
Well, and I think, I've seen maybe that organization, but certainly if not others that have followed, either smaller or full-on versions of that model. And I will say I'm a huge fan of an advisory board or an emeritus or a whatever you want to call it and however you want to structure it. And I find, we talked earlier about, what do you do with the board member that thinks they know everything? I think a related question is, what do you do with the board member that won't let go but never comes? And the answer right there is you convince them that that board member has more on the line serving, as part of the governing board with those fiduciary duties, and you demonstrate how much more effective and how much more protected the organization and the individual would be by rolling them off into one of those advisory or emeritus positions. And despite all of the angst and drama that folks anticipate will go into that conversation, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, that individual is so relieved to step right on out of that fiduciary role and jump onto the fundraising board, which is perhaps maybe what they always wanted to do, right? And I think that's what enables exactly what you're talking about, is not everyone wants to rise to that level of oversight and regularly paying attention, showing up, looking at all of the things, digging through all the documents. Not everyone wants to do that on a regular basis. And sometimes having that process in place to prompt the term limits, it allows exactly that type of rollover where the individual can find where they want to be at the time.
Yes, to all of that. Talking about the needs of the donor versus the needs of the community. What does the donor want to do or say that they want their money to go for, as opposed sometimes to what the community really needs?
Yes.
And so that's a conversation that I've had with different clients. And it can get really
sticky.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Emotional.
Yeah.
No, it is. And I can understand why. I mean, my goodness, I can think of a personal scenario where, at school that my daughter was going to, I thought they needed a certain level of equipment. We offered to contribute and they never took us up on that. And I won't lie, it was a little sticky. Not externally, but I felt a bit sticky and emotional around that topic. But if I look back at that with full perspective, who am I as the parent to decide? Who am I as the donor to decide that they needed this particular type of playground equipment versus the other, right? I'm not the one running the school. I'm not the one with the expertise. I'm not the child playing on the things. Maybe I'm not the best situated to decide. But then again, I did have the money. So I don't know. And that was a very, very small amount of money relative to perhaps the donors that were engaging in these conversations. So no, it is a very sticky conversation. I think related to that, you see it in the context of grant making as well, around this whole tension between, do we fund operating expenses and or do we require a grantee to kind of prove how they're using, where they're using, how effective they are, but can they put the lights on? You see a lot of tension around all of these issues related to, I want to say control. That's probably not quite the right word, but who knows best, which individuals, which groups know best how to support the intended cause or support the intended community. And yeah, it can get a little sticky.
I think control is probably the best.
I hesitate to use it, but I think that probably is about what it comes down to, and not from a super negative perspective. I certainly don't think that many of the donors would view it that way, when in fact it might, kind of come down to those sorts of issues.
Well, and, also that goes back to what we were just talking about before this question of the donor intent, which is one thing. Do we focus solely on that? Does that trump everything else? And I would say no, it doesn't,
unless it's legally required to. But yes.
But like in your example of like the playground equipment,
yes,
it's because you have the money doesn't make you right in choosing the equipment and all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
So it's got to be that balance. And talking with the other side, the staff people, the executive director, is like, okay, so what have you told your donors, your parents, that you actually need?
Yeah.
So there's that, anyway.
There is.
That communication that needs to happen.
Well, and not just that, but I think we talked about mission creep. What you're alluding to now is, kind of a fundraising or development, almost education opportunity to ensure that fundraising and development staff or leaders and directors and whoever is fundraising for the organization fully understands A, what the mission and purpose is, B, what helps you get there, and C, the import of their language, or maybe more importantly, their written communications with donors, because you see it time and time and time again. And not to pick on development staff, because it's not their fault if they've never been educated around how to navigate this arena. Their job is to bring in money, and you bring in money usually by saying yes to people. You want to put these strings on this money? Great. Yes. You want to use it only for this purpose? Absolutely. We want to do that for every single gift across our entire endowment, such that we have 506 sub-funds? Yes, because it brings in more money. And that's their goal, unless you've told them otherwise. But then you look at that 10 years down the road, and the lawyer and the accountant's head is going to explode because A, they can't track it, and probably no one has along the way. But beyond that, those 506 sub-funds, it may be that a very small portion of them actually directly furthers the organization. And it may be that so many of them cost so much in time or energy or literal financial cost to comply with that they don't do a whole lot of good. I worked with an organization a number of years ago that spent a significant amount of time fundraising for a gorgeous, stunning new facility. And they were very focused, rightly so, on creating an endowment for that facility. But they underfunded the operating organization. So they had bright and shiny endowment, bright and shiny facility, and they could barely keep the lights on. And, I have seen that scenario in different iterations time and time again. And that's exactly it. Who doesn't want to bring in $2 million to put the beautiful name up on the XYZ offices or the XYZ conference room or what have you, the football field? It's very easy to fall into that. It's a big issue for sure, and one that probably deserves more focus and definitely more education, so that the leadership of the organizations and the legal and tax compliance folks can get on the same page with the development staff, so that they're all working cohesively towards the same mission and purposes in a way that, gets them from point A to point B.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. And again, going back to just crystal clear communications, which you think you're doing it and you're not. But yes, I'm agreeing with you on that one. I do want to shift a little bit to, again, still talking about fundraising and boards to some extent, but this has to do with the shifting in generational wealth. That has been happening. That's happening. Baby boomers are, making their exit, some, and going to continue to for probably another decade or so. But today's donors are not giving like their grandparents did or their great-grandparents did. What do you see as the future of philanthropy in the U.S. from your point of view?
Oh, goodness. Okay, well, that's a lofty question that I am not even going to try to answer.
Oh.
But I will give you an answer, and I think it's a more interesting one than pontificating around things that I don't know. So we see it more often from the board perspective than the donor perspective, because most of our client base is the actual organization. So, in a lot of instances, there's significant overlap there, particularly in the family foundation context, which is, of course, where we get to see in the most clear fashion that transition of generational wealth. And I'll share, what we observe there. We've worked with, a number of different foundations and families over the course of my career, but particularly in the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years, where you've got that transition from first generation who made all the money, founded all the things, set up the foundation, down to second generation who probably is really running things right now. And then third generation who are, coming out of college, coming out of law school, maybe even having kids of their own. And it really is fascinating to see the broadening of scope. You want to talk about difficulty staying on mission. The broadening of geographic scope, because those younger generations are not staying put in the same way that prior generations may have. The broadening, or I will say division, that comes into play with different views, right? Whether they be political or otherwise. That's a huge one that we see within that intergenerational wealth. And then I think what you were probably alluding to, which is the view of how individuals think charity or social endeavors should be done. So, I'm smiling thinking of a conversation at a family foundation meeting where, generation one, who again founded the things, did the things, made the money, had very strong views about very worthy grant-making causes. But it was dollars being doled out in just a very traditional view of grant-making. The third generation was sitting there all fired up. Really riled. They wanted to go, build water wells in sub-Saharan Africa and, create new vaccines. They wanted to do things that were on the ground, helping real people. And they were appalled at the idea of creating a park bench with a pretty plaque on it and flowers built around it, right? And they're both doing good. Who's to say one is better than the other? It's certainly not my place. But that tension and that evolution is wildly apparent. And some foundations that we work with, some are battling it out. Others, you see those first generations kind of throwing up their hands and saying, okay, this isn't our fight anymore. This isn't our endeavor anymore. You are part of this world. Where do you want to go with this? Whatever you think makes sense within the confines that we've laid out. So that evolution, I think, is a really fascinating and striking one. And I do think, maybe that does answer your question, but in a less lofty way.
Yes, and then on the nonprofit organizational side is, we're not watching, those battles. We know something must be going on. Mm-hmm. But to figure out, are they still going to fund us or not, or how or who? And oftentimes an organization who's received funding forever, and they go to apply, they don't check to see if anything's changed. They just assume it's all there, and they're turned down. And there's we were depending on this.
Yes. Yes. No, and that's exactly, this very conversation, I think it ended up something like, okay, grandson, granddaughter, go do some research, because I don't know anything about building wells or creating vaccines, but go figure it out and come back and we'll hear you. We'll talk about it. And then on the other side of the coin, it was, okay, but granddad saying, well, what if, or maybe it was moderated by an advisor in the room, asking Granddad if perhaps he could go back to the organization that had suggested the really pretty park bench and see if maybe there was something a little more along the lines of what granddaughter and grandson could support. And it's more about, I mean, my goodness, we do it in our practice. There's things that we do it over and over. We do it the same way every time, and it becomes habit. Most of the organizations that are putting out pretty park benches are probably doing other things as well and could come up with a different proposal for that donor. Maybe it still doesn't pass muster, but it may be a whole lot closer. But you're right. It's a huge struggle on the organizational side, understanding the where and the why and meeting them in the middle, because I do see, and I have heard those conversations repeatedly at the board level but we can't just turn this off because we've now decided that we are focused in a different direction. Or, yes, we have the power to do so. However, we need to think about the impact and import of our decision-making because we have funded this organization at this level for every year for the last 25 years. They are at this point expecting it. And that is, it's quite a tension. It's quite a tension.
One of the things I've liked seeing is when a foundation will let people know, they'll have it on their website, say, okay, in 3 years, we're going to be phasing this out and we're going to be moving. Mm-hmm. That's wonderful and that's so helpful. And see it sometimes, not often enough, but that is one way that on the foundation side could help the organizations that are looking to them for support.
Agreed.
2 more little questions.
Sure.
One is, do you have, it's about resources for nonprofits or charities or whichever term we're going to use.
Yeah. Now I've gotten in your head about that, haven't I? You'll question it for a while. This is good, though. This is good. I'm doing my job.
Some books or podcasts or publications or other resources that an ED or a board chair should be aware of to stay compliant with rules governing nonprofit charitable organizations.
Nothing really comprehensive, all in, like you can go to this one place. There are a few that I think are really well put together for certain things. So I know from the IRS perspective, if we're talking about tax exemption related issues or, 501c3 or 501c anything else, I think the information on the IRS website is really accessible and really useful. They've got these life cycles where it walks through kind of soup to nuts, from formation to end of life to operation and all the things you might see in between. And it's really very technically correct, which of course you would expect, but it's also fairly accessible. And they've got a lot of great things you can kind of search from and dig into. So I think that would be one huge resource for any organization that has a tax exemption and is focused on the federal tax side. And it's not deep nitty gritty, but it's, I think, about the right level for kind of what you're explaining. Is an ED that knows something, knows enough to be dangerous, but wants to sort of flesh it out with a little more substance and knowledge. Mm-hmm. I think on the state side, for certain things, there's some pretty good resources. So I know, for example, the Comptroller's website and the Secretary of State website both have some really great guidance on like sales tax exemptions, which maybe sounds like a really random thing, but it's something that, every PTA, every booster club has to deal with. And it's like, well, do we have to collect sales tax on each thing of brownies that we sell and each T-shirt that we sell? And it's quite a bugaboo for little tiny organizations doing really important things, but without the budget to hire a big lawyer, right? I think there's some great resources there. There's also, for that similarly situated clients, there's some great resources around like gambling and everything that is not allowed in that perspective, like PSA, don't do casino nights, don't do raffles, don't do any of those things unless you know what you're doing. But there's great resources there for, again, that kind of small, mid-sized organization that maybe isn't going to go hire a lawyer to tell them those things, but needs some guidance.
You might have already mentioned this in an earlier question, but I do have one last question I always like to ask. Is there like one thing that you would like our listeners to take away with them from our conversation?
I think it goes back to kind of where we started, which is while most, not all, but most of the rules and parameters in this sector, whether it be on the state or the federal level, most of them are not rocket science. They're not overly complicated. But you do need to have a level of awareness of what is out there and what you're subject to, because the simple fact of going out with all the passion in the world to do good in the community is not quite enough to keep you out of trouble, whether that be from a regulator, public eye, optics, PR, media, you name it. It's not going to be enough. So you've got to find a way to marry that passion with some structure from a compliance perspective and an awareness that those compliance rules are out there and rather important.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time, Danica. This has been really interesting.
Happy to be here. Happy to get some information out there. I think we both share that view that the more education and the more information is out there within the sector, the better it is for everyone. So happy to do it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.